So I never thought I'd have to make this kind of video. But I think at this point I don't really have a choice. StarCitizen is having a crisis of identity when it comes to flight. It seems like through all the different flight models that we've had since 2014, they've kind of gone over and rehashed a lot of things that didn't work in the past, but now just rebranded to different things now. Now, I have played every single patch since the game first came out, every single flight model, every single iteration, every single tuning, and every single ship since the game first came out. And there's a lot of things that I've really enjoyed through that process, and a lot of things that I feel like they tried, but it just didn't work. Now, the purpose of this video is to help educate and inform you guys on just exactly the issues that are causing StarCitizen, I think, to have a bit of a crisis. Combat, in general, has to work. And in order for it to work, we have to get to a place where multi-crew ships are viable, fighters are viable, things are working so that the game can express itself, and also people don't feel like they're playing a pay-to-win game, or that ships are largely ineffective and there's only a few meta ships that everyone has to fly. We want to avoid these situations. We want to get to a place where every ship is viable in some way, that people can defend themselves no matter what ship they are. But over the years, what I've noticed is CIG will take a flight model, start working on it, and almost get there, and then throw it out and start completely new from the ground up. I've seen this happen 4 separate times on 4 different flight models. And at this point, I'm throwing my hands up in the air and I'm asking the tough questions. What are we doing? Because there are some fundamental flaws in the logic in which CIG is going about trying to adjust their flight models. And a lot of it has to do with the fundamental design rather than the individual little tunings that have been going on. So that we can actually start playing the game and feeling a little bit less like this.
I bet you're putting him out of his misery. All right, download a patch. Bye.
Since StarCitizen was originally concepted, it's always been argued as a space sim. Now, a lot of people have been saying over the years that StarCitizen is becoming less and less of a space sim and much more of a space shooter. Now, I think this sometimes is something that people don't realize, in the sense that in the 90s, when Freelancer and Star Wars games and all those space quote-unquote sims were actually playable, they were much more of a space shooter, and they didn't do what's called 6 degrees of freedom. They had what's called 3 degrees of freedom. So essentially what they were was planes in space. You couldn't really strafe. You could maybe drift a little bit in some of the old games like Free Space, but games like X-Men vs. TIE Fighter, Freelancer, and a lot of these kind of 90s space shooters were considered space sims at the time. So I think when Chris says, I want to make the best space sim ever, I think what he's really saying is I want to make the best space shooter ever. And don't forget too, Chris Roberts is a cinematics kind of guy. He's a dreamer. He's somebody who has lots of crazy ideas, obviously has been successful in Hollywood, but I'd hardly consider him to be a hardcore PC gamer, considering his original pitch for the Kickstarter, he was holding an Xbox controller. Now, this isn't a knock on Chris Roberts. He doesn't have to be a super sweaty PvPer to enjoy his own product. But I think people have to taper their expectations when it comes to StarCitizen, in the sense that it's not going to be a space sim. The idea of space sim is basically just a marketing ploy. What StarCitizen is probably going to become is your typical space shooter. Now, in order for that to happen, we got to make some hard choices. Because right now, they're trying to make a 6 degrees of freedom game accessible to as many people as possible. And that's a difficult task, because 6 degrees of freedom is the most difficult type of game you could possibly try and make. There is simply not enough games out there in the common ether for people to understand. There's very few games that even have this kind of mechanic system. And so naturally what happens is the learning curve, or the barrier to entry, is very, very high. Now, this can also mean that the depth of the gameplay, and there's so many benefits that come from having such a unique experience, that Star Citizen really can kind of solidify itself as being a very unique thing. And what we've gotten at the moment is a very strange hybrid between a 3 degree of freedom game and a 6 degree of freedom game. Now, CIG on many occasions has drawn inspiration from other shows and movies and television series to kind of get the ship movement in combat to a certain place that they want to make it feel. And so many times we've seen people in CIG reference, Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica, but the sad reality is those two different styles of movement are fundamentally different, because Star Wars functions on a completely different principle that Battlestar Galactica does. So I want to play you guys a few different clips from these different TV shows and explain kind of what's going on in these realms so that we can better understand what Star Citizen is trying to achieve and what we have right now and how that's not conducive to the health of the game. Now, I remember watching Star Wars Episode 1 when I was a kid, and being fascinated with the style of combat and flights. But as we can see from these examples, the movie and Star Wars in general functions on a very simple principle. World War II dogfighters could only move in 3 degrees, which means I can go forward, I can move to the left and right, up and down, that kind of stuff, but I've only got my 3 degrees of freedom. And fundamentally, like, the nature of how Star Wars combat functions and why it's cinematic the way it is because ships can only go 3 different ways. They basically function like planes in space. And although it makes for incredibly cinematic and beautiful chase fighting, which Star Citizen on many occasions has been arguing for, they're saying, oh, we want to have chase fighting in our game, we want to have nose to tail kind of stuff. Well, nose to tail behavior comes specifically from 3 degrees of fighting. I mean, let's take this example here from episode 2 where the Slave 1 is engaging the Jedi Starfighter. In this situation in space, there is no reason why Obi-Wan can't just turn around and engage his target. But because in Star Wars land, if you slow down, apparently you'd fall out of the sky in space. So there's always going to be a level of belief suspension that has to happen for Star Wars fundamentals to be the same. Now, Star Wars has always been this way, and so we as viewers and people that are watching, we watch Star Wars and we think, oh, this looks normal because everything behaves this way. But obviously in space, you'd just be able to turn around and engage, which is very, I guess you could say, true of this example here from Battlestar Galactica, which is much closer to what we used to have with our 322 flight model. Now, the real question is, if Star Citizen's trying to make a combat system that feels cinematic, that has these moments of just beautiful, dynamic combat shots, we also have to have agreement on the rule sets of how those ships move and function in the world. In the example shown here for BSG, we can see very clearly that the way that these fighters are behaving is very similar to what we had in the previous flight model. Any direction that they want to go, up, strafe, left, right, whatever, is independent of how the ship systems function and how the ships fly. It makes Battlestar Galactica's dogfighting and combat in general feel so much more believable because it's how you would expect something to fly in space properly. Also, the design language of very tiny fighters being small in space is also something that lends itself to what would actually be effective, considering if you were to fight an alien or hostile race of robotic dogfighting enemies. But I mean, what the point I'm trying to make here is, if a Battlestar Galactica fighter comes up against a Star Wars X-Wing, the BSG fighter is just going to spin its nose onto you and shoot you, because in Star Wars land, you have to fly like an airplane, and in Battlestar Galactica land, you can fly like a spaceship. And the fundamental differences here are in the degrees of freedom that each ship expresses. Now, obviously, Star Wars is more popular than BSG. It's a lot wider known. It fundamentally flies like planes in space, as you can see here in these examples with Star Wars Rogue One, which had some of the most beautiful, breathtaking shots I think Star Wars has ever made. I mean, if Star Wars is the benchmark for how Star Citizen combat is trying to cinematically feel, then you cannot have a 6 Degrees of Freedom game in the world of Star Wars. As we can see here, notice that everything that these X-Wings are doing and TIE Fighters are all moving directly towards where their nose is pointing. There's no strafing at all. There's no up, down, left, or right strafing. And this causes the nose-to-tail cinematic kind of behavior that we'd expect to see from, World War II planes in space. These kind of dynamics, I think, is where Star Citizen is having a bit of an identity crisis. Because if we look at previous flight models, they keep on trying to dance between 3 degrees of freedom and 6 degrees of freedom. And what they're ended up doing is they're kind of failing at both. Master modes, although it does reduce the scale floor a little bit to make it easier for pilots to get into, what they've essentially tried to do is ham fist a 6 degrees of freedom game into a 3 degrees of freedom game. And so my argument has always been, if you're going to do one the best you can do. Because if you're not going to make a true 6 degrees of freedom game, which is kind of much more what we had in the previous flight model, then just make it 3 degrees of freedom, because here's the thing. If you look at these fights, the speed at which these fighters are flying, banking, turning, and existing in this combat environment are incredibly fast. The amount of speed in these turns, the amount of speed at which they can transition from vector to vector is, you're pulling an immense amount of G's. And the problem with Star Citizen's combat model right now is we have all these weird feeling combat ships with these invisible walls that you end up hitting. Master Modes introduces a whole ton of new mechanics to making flight feel so much more binary and much less based on, I guess you could say, a believable system. And what I mean by that is, if you've played Master Modes, you know that you're constantly switching between different modes depending on your speed. If you strafe in certain directions at certain angles, at certain speeds, you're hitting these invisible speed walls, which are not intuitive, and it's also not in the public domain in terms of the public consciousness. People who play Star Citizen probably have absolutely no idea how 6 degrees of freedom actually functions and behaves. And so we have this weird cross between a 6 degrees of freedom game, which is what we had before, to a bastardized version of a 3 degrees of freedom game, which doesn't really give us the benefits of the speed and exciting kind of nature of gameplay that we'd expect from a 3 degrees of freedom game, which can be shown for examples like with Star Wars Squadrons being a true 3 degrees of freedom game. The speed at which the fights happen and the intensity of the combat is significantly more exciting than something like Star Citizen, which is attempting to be a cinematic fighter experience. So we've kind of established the differences between 3 degrees of freedom and 6 degrees of freedom. And at the current time, Star Citizen is a 6 degrees of freedom game that's trying to pigeonhole our ships into flying more like what you see on the example here in 3 degrees of freedom, because it's more cinematic, it's more easier to pick up. There's less things for you to worry about because all you need to worry about is going forward, left, right, up, down. And this may be easier. This may be more available to the general public. This may be a much more simplified version of flight that a lot more people can wrap their heads around. But what we end up having is, I think, a lack of depth. And the whole Battlestar Galactica style of combat, which is kind of what we were, mostly playing with in the previous model, was just so difficult for people to pick up. So what Master Modes achieves is the attempt, at least, at creating a nose-to-tail environment in a space setting. And what they've done is they've basically locked combat speeds that actually can avoid fire and create deflections that are meaningful, locked to the higher end of the afterburner spectrum. Whereas if you try to fight in 6 degrees of freedom in your what's called SCM, you end up fighting at such a low speed against projectiles that are so much faster that it doesn't really matter what you do at those speeds because you're going to get hit no matter what happens. This leads to the whole issue we have now where interceptors are so powerful in PvP combat because they can maintain and stay at a higher, I guess you could say, altitude or higher energy state for longer, which allows them to control the fight a lot better. Now, what this has done is it's made the combat feel horrendous, like just absolutely terrible, because you have to hold your boost down to have any meaningful speed, to make any meaningful choices in combat. And as soon as you're out of boost and you can no longer maintain that speed, you have to enter nav mode and wait for your boost to recharge. And so, you know, what I said before about they've kind of got both games. They've got a 6th game, but only at low speeds, which is not meaningful in combat. So it's just a lie. And they've got a 3 degrees of freedom game at higher speeds because we have an asymmetrical quote unquote speed zone, which means we can only maintain our speed if our nose is the same direction as our vector. Because if we start to pull our nose around and play Battlestar Galactica, we're going to drop all our energy, all our speed. We're going to go back down to that SCM zone. And really, there's no avoiding anything at that speed. And so they have a poor product when it comes to 3 DOF because you can't maintain speed, you don't feel like you're flying, and it just doesn't feel good. And they've got a poor 6 DOF product because you can go into 6 degrees of freedom, but nothing you do is meaningful because the tuning is so poorly done that you can't avoid fire and everyone just gets smoked. So they got to make a choice. Are you going to make a 3 degrees of freedom game, or are you going to make a 6 degrees of freedom game? And you know, I've always maintained this position that I think Star Citizen should be a unique and in-depth experience, and I don't see any reason why Star Citizen shouldn't lean into its uniqueness of being a 6 degrees of freedom game. There's really nothing else like there, except for maybe Elite Dangerous, that can compete. We've got plenty of 3 degrees of freedom games. We've got DCS World, we've got so many playing game, War Thunder. There's tons of 3 degrees of freedom games out there that do a great job, but there's very few that are 6 degrees of freedom. And the fact that CIG is not leaning into that uniqueness, I think is a huge mistake. You know, it's just a huge mistake. I think they're really dropping the ball on this one. I think they really need to consider leaning into the 6 degrees of freedom aspect of the game, because it's what makes Star Citizen so incredibly fun. Like, there's just so much you can do with that. If we take this example here from a show called The Expanse, which is a very hardcore look at what space combat would probably look and feel like in the relatively near future. Engagement distances are quite long. They're using a lot of BVR tools. They're using extremely high velocity projectile weapon systems like railguns. G-forces are being applied to the pilots. Missile systems are used as obviously like a projected damage, and PDCs are, you know, point defense turrets are a very, you know, a great line of defense versus incoming missile barrages and that kind of stuff. You could easily see an RSI constellation behaving like how the Rocinante in this example behaves, with PDC turrets able to shoot down incoming missiles, you know, which just changes the whole dynamic look and feel of the experience. I think we can definitely have something that's more like you would see The Expanse or Battlestar Galactica, which gives us just such a visceral feel, such a in-depth, or how do I say it this way, authentic, immersive experience of what space like combat would look and feel like. There's no reason why we should have insanely high ranges, but if we were to take the 322 flight model, it would look and feel a lot more like how this example here is for The Expanse. So in this example, the weapon systems, the ranges, everything about how the ships interact in this world has everything to do with 6 degrees of freedom. Because the ship at any time can move in any direction, depending on which thrusters it's firing, at what times, and blah, blah, blah. It's very reminiscent of what we used to have with the previous model. And this was difficult for a lot of people.
What was the problem, and why was this deemed the solution?
Well, first off, I think the fact that we're working on a live game, the issue is that we should always be looking at, even if we've got a system that's out in the wild, we should be looking at evaluating it, and does it deliver the gameplay that we want, that the community wants, that Chris wants. Looked at the combat as a whole, you know, and we're talking a long time ago now. I mean, I was still on Star Citizen. It was probably pre-Squadron when we started talking about master modes. A lot of the combat that we saw across the broad spectrum of the community, not just the new players and not just the very well experienced players, but the broad spectrum basically became jousting. And, you know, we felt that we could do better than that. A lot of the combat that we saw across the broad spectrum basically became jousting. Basically became jousting. Jousting.
Watch your speed. He's coming right at us.
Sorry, I had a little fun when I was making this video, but this is a problem because this shows me that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of flight systems and characteristics. So let me explain. Because you cannot have jousting and also flight movement, like they come hand in hand. Jousting is the result of a high energy state when you're engaging somebody. And if you don't have high energy in flight, then you don't have merging and flight skill. And if you remove so much of that, you actually cause more jousting. So with master modes, you actually have more jousting because you have less degrees to move in, which I think is quite ironic considering the point, like they're saying, is master modes is supposed to reduce jousting, but reducing our range of motion and reducing our speeds so that we can only move in one direction really fast, this actually promotes jousting, which is a fundamental part of a 3 degrees of freedom flight experience, which is what you'd expect from, you know, World War II dogfighters. Let me show you some examples of jousting. Star Wars Episode 1, tons of jousting there because they're flying under 3 degrees of freedom. More jousting in Episode 3 because why not? Lots of jousting in Episode 4 leading to a kill from Wedge. Tons of jousting in Episode 6 because again, moving in 3 degrees of freedom. Even jousting in 6 degrees of freedom with Battlestar Galactica because they have the speeds to do it. A little bit of jousting here in master modes because it's the only way to get away from incoming fire. And just to top it off, jousting with RC planes and firecrackers. You know, because geometry is geometry.
Now, I know that there's a lot of discussion points around master modes where we're talking about lowering the ceiling cap.
Well, unfortunately, it has. In fact, the top comment on the feedback for master modes is a very in-depth takedown of exactly why the system is not working. And ironically enough, calling for the same thing that I've been arguing for, which is increasing our speed so we actually have some room to move around and engage.
And, you know, that was never the intention. That's not our inspiration. Our intention really is to try and create a system that is fair to use for all players, that allows players to come on and still feel like they can engage in the game and compete, but still reward the very best pilots.
So they want an accessible game that's deep, skill-based, that focuses on the flight experience, but also has low jousting. So they've reduced the flight ceiling so low that people can get in, which also has reduced the skill ceiling, and yet tried to keep the depth in combat by adding a lot of knowledge barriers to adding different modes and being able to seamlessly switch between those modes to try and reduce jousting, which is a fundamental part of three-dimensional movement. Boy.
I want to be able to share this experience with my friends and fight against real opponents in space, not just AI. And I want this to be as good or better than any other game out there. And I want to actively push the boundaries of what you can do in a game.
If there's one thing that unites all of us backers, is that we're all kind of dreamers. But every once in a while you need someone to come around and splash you with some cold water to wake you up, to make sure that the dream doesn't just stay a dream, that it actually coalesces into something real. And that's all I'm trying to do with this kind of video. If we want to achieve those goals of a multiplayer environment, there's certain rules that we have to abide by. If you make and design a game that can be exploited based on its design, players are going to use that to maximize their effectiveness against other players, which means in a multiplayer environment, you can't afford to be lazy with the mechanics. We see this time and time again with so many online games, and I'd hate for StarCitizen to fall victim to that kind of behavior. We see this behavior already happening now with master modes, where players engaging each other are constantly switching into nav mode and then back down, which is originally, from my assumption, based on a solo player or single player design choice. How do I get the player from this point to that point in my mission set, regardless of how that affects the multiplayer environment? This is a critical design issue that is coming from the solo play first mentality, which when translated into a multiplayer environment adds an immense layer of exploitation and just terrible gameplay feeling that we've all been kind of enduring since Mastermode has been released. Chris also mentions about that he wants to be as good or better than the things that have come before, and that he wants to constantly push the boundaries of what's possible. Well, in terms of flight, Master Modes isn't really doing anything new. In fact, it's taking what was once very unique and pushing the boundaries and puts it down to this kind of cookie cutter, well, 3 Degrees of Freedom shooter game that we've all kind of gotten used to. And although there are mechanics with Master Modes that does help with bringing people into the game, what it sacrifices is, in my opinion, just too much of the uniqueness of the game itself. And is why I created that video a while ago talking about, does everyone really understand what you're giving up for Master Modes? And the thing is, it's not like we're too far away from the horse here. The beautiful thing about being in an alpha state is that we can change things. And I have always been and have been an avid supporter of bringing the flight aspects of the ship movement back to where I think they could feel a lot better. It's overwhelmingly in support at the moment with bringing SCM speeds a little higher, which is going to allow for the more Battlestar Galactica style dogfighting to exist and less of the kind of nose to tail 3 degrees of fighting that you see Master Modes really trying to push. The thing is, if they want to push the 3 degrees of fighting aspect of the game, they have to seriously take a look at how they're tuning and designing ships to make 3 degrees of fighting the actual way to play. Because like I said before with the multiplayer side, whatever game mechanics you originally set out to do, unless you design them with multiplayer in mind, players will take that, abuse, and use that to gain advantage over other people. So if your game is multiplayer at all, it has to take priority over a single player experience, because the experience that people are going to have in multiplayer is going to be the dominant experience. Unless Squadron 42 decides to go with its own flight model, which at this point, I don't see any reason why they shouldn't consider that option, because the Squadron 42 flight model that we're experiencing now with Master Modes is just simply not the right solution for a multiplayer environment. We were a significantly better spot off with the previous flight model. The only problem with the previous one was there were some core fundamental issues that, to be honest, could have easily been evolved and fixed with some of the solutions in Master Modes. We could also receive a much similar situation where if we took Master Modes and just brought the SCM speeds up, if Chris Roberts wants to push the limits of what's possible, what better way than to create a game that nobody else has ever really seen, and to have a flight experience that's unlike anything else, including Elite Dangerous. Also, don't forget that we have plenty of planets and atmosphere for 3 degrees of freedom dogfighting to flourish without having to force space fighting into a very similar realm. It homogenizes and makes all of the gameplay feel kind of the same, whether or not you're in space or in atmosphere. You're kind of still flying like an airplane. And to me, I think that's a shame, because to have a deep and engaging experience, don't you want to have different flexibility of different ships depending on whether they're in space or in atmosphere? Don't you want to feel like you're in space just like you want to feel like you're in atmosphere? If we're designing something that's never been done before, and we really are pushing the limits like Chris is claiming he wants to do, why does Master Modes fall into this category of just another generic shooter that, to be honest, doesn't do anything unique, nothing revolutionary, and to be honest, kind of doesn't really do it well at all? Games like DCS are significantly better at 3 Degrees of Freedom. Hell, even War Thunder is better. So if we're pushing the limits, are we really sure Master Modes is the answer? There's nothing inherently wrong with trying new things out and testing and seeing what works and what doesn't. But my gripe with this whole issue is the fact that Afterburner cruise mode / nav mode has already been tried before. Back in previous flight models, we already had cruise mode. We already had Afterburner. And the fans didn't like them for pretty obvious reasons. And yet here we are again in 2024 with nav mode has just been rebranded from cruise mode, and Afterburner's made a comeback. And so we're back to square one. So from my point of view, if CIG wants to make a great flight experience, they just have to start realizing that the multiplayer has to start becoming a priority in terms of game design. You can't have a nav mode system that can be abused by players, because players are simply going to stay in nav mode and start dropping out like they are now. If this was actually designed multiplayer first, these mechanics would never have made it through, considering also in Evocati and also PTU testing threads, many people in the player versus player community have always been telling CIG that this is the wrong choice, but they didn't listen. And so now we're in a very weird spot. But we got time, and it's not all doom and gloom. So the two choices CIG has is, if they're going to decide to make a more 3 Degrees of Freedom game, here are some suggestions that SIG can do to help Master Modes be the best 3 DOF game it can kind of be. 1. Keep people's ability to maintain speed and adjust the accelerations so that there's enough play within the speed zones that we have to allow for merging, catching targets, and nose-to-tail chasing. The current tuning we have right now is way too lopsided. Our SCM speeds are way too low, and boost must be pressed down to keep the afterburner, quote unquote, firing to keep you at those high speeds. They might want to consider removing afterburner entirely and just allowing us to fight inside this asymmetrical speed zone. So if we're flying straight and building and maintaining speed, as we fly straight, we're going to be able to maintain our speed, because in any kind of dogfighting or aerial combat, you're able to maintain speed, which feels really good for flight movement. Having to hold down a boost button to push against space drag makes the entire experience absolutely miserable. There's basically no throttle control to be had in Master Modes at the current time. It's mostly just throttling and pressing the boost button so that you maintain a speed slightly higher than your SCM speed. That should tell you something. Number 2, if they decide to go more of the 6 Degrees of Freedom route, which is what I personally think the game excels in and what is so unique about the experience, is bring the SCM speeds much higher so that we can fly in all 6 Degrees of Freedom. Because if we don't have that large zone to play in, then we have this very real issue of creating an environment where movement is so constricted like it is now that the differences between ships don't get noticed. And the skill of the pilot, the flight aspects of the movement, aren't really what's being showcased. It's the ship you choose, which is very close and very dangerously close to a very pay-to-win style game, which I think CIG would like to avoid, along with their fans. But what do you think? Do you think StarCitizen's direction towards a 3 Degrees of Freedom kind of flight model is the right one? Or do you feel like 6 Degrees of Freedom is where the game should probably start pushing towards? Whatever the case may be, leave your comments here in the Discord or here on the YouTube channel. As well, please consider posting your feedback on Spectrum so that CIG can get as much information as they can to hopefully make the most informed decision. This was just my opinion, so take it for a grain of salt, but it comes from a place of love and genuine respect for the project and the game, and the want and desire to see this thing through to the end, and to make sure that we get the best damn space sim ever. Special thanks to all the CIG devs out there working on this project and being passionate about it like all of us here. I really hope that people don't take this message as me trying to bash on master modes or flight in general, but a genuine inquiry as to the situation that we see ourselves constantly being put in about the flight and relationship of ships and how they move and how it works in Star Citizen. Are we making a 3 Degrees of Freedom game, or are we making a 6? And don't miss, on June 8th at the Apno Esports channel on Twitch, we'll be broadcasting the AVS Apno Esports Flight for Kids charity tournament. And I hope to see all you folks out there at 1800 UTC for a few hours for us to goof around in master modes, throw some prizes away, and raise some money for Sick Kids Hospital. My name is Avenger1. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.